We have a busy, busy day. And as long as you're willing to stay, I'm willing to talk. We're talking about a theme which is a mythical theme, and that is the wandering Jew. And the wandering Jew, El Judeo Errante, did I pronounce it correctly? Or Juan espera a Dios. Now, when we talk about the issue of the wandering Jew, in a sense, I want to begin by giving you a sense of what one can think about in terms of the historical notion, before I go into dealing with the myth. And at some point, what is important for you to realize is that because of the fact that Jews wandered so much and went from one country to another, the myth seemed to have tremendous versatility. Versatility meaning that it could be used in Spain, it could be used in Hungary, it can be used in many countries. Okay? Versatility, you could just take this notion and play with it once the notion emerged. And what I thought would be valuable to begin with is to share with you something about a historian, Simon Dubnow, D-U-B-N-O-W. Oh, isn't that nice? Dubnow Simon, 1860 to 1941. Now, Dubnow was a Jew of Russian descent who, unlike the historians we mentioned when we talked about Mendelssohn, neither Gretz, Jost, or others, who thought that the modern period begins with Mendelssohn, Dubnow went in a different way. And I want to mention the fact that he wrote a world history of the Jews, a Weltgeschichte. Now, when you think of the notion of a world history of the Jews, in Dubnow's understanding, we're speaking about not only world history in terms of space, but also in terms of time. In a sense, Dubnow thought that the Jews were a kind of eternal people. What will become in the wandering Jew the notion of an ewige Jude, somebody who lives forever and can live in any place. And so when you read Dubnow's Weltgeschichte, the world history of the Jews, you encounter a historian who thinks that one of the most important characteristics of the Jews was their ability to move from one place to another, to wander. And therefore, when Dubnow is writing his history, he's thinking of the fact that as Jews wandered, sometimes they came into a new situation and they were able to move to another place and therefore created institutions which enabled them to continue to exist in the new situation. So it's interesting. For Dubnow, the notion that Jews could be able to recreate themselves in new places. If they were expelled from Spain, they went to Portugal. If they had to leave Portugal, they went somewhere else. And they always were able to create a new kind of basis. So in that sense, you could say that Dubnow was an optimistic historian. He believed, as he does at the end of the 19th century, that when Jews are maybe leaving Eastern Europe and going to the United States or to other places, he didn't see this as a negative phenomenon, even if this was something which came out of the fact that either economic or political reasons, Jews had to move. And so, for Dubnov, it was clear that the ability of the Jews to recreate themselves in new places, because they were always bringing with them their own intellectual, social ways of thinking, and therefore they could recreate themselves in a new situation. And this was a very positive way of thinking. Now, so when I say that he, unlike the others, like Gretz and Jost, believed that it was not Mendelssohn who begins the modern period, but the French Revolution. Now it's interesting. Why does he choose the French Revolution? Because Dubnov really believed that there was a necessity for Jews to have a political basis within the country that they were living. And therefore, he thought that the fact that Jews had equality from 1790, 1791 in France, this enabled them to base themselves in France, and maybe this was going to be the process of the modern period. But it's interesting, when one reads Dubnov, in that section on the modern period, one of the first things one encounters is his disappointment or disagreement with elements within the Jewish community who were not willing to demand sufficiently their need to have an autonomous existence. Okay? Autonomous existence. In other words, that without their own organizational construct, they wouldn't be able to maintain themselves as a Jewish community in France. But as I say, migration was very much built into the way he thought about the world, he thought about the Jews, and therefore, when he comes into disagreements with people like Echad Ha'am, the Zionist, he basically believes that if you take that ability of Jews to move from one place to another, you're going to limit them. In that sense, Dubnov believed, and this is important in terms of a kind of background of thinking about this problem, is that for Dubnov, land was not significant. Sovereignty was not significant. What you needed is your ability to take your mental consciousness, your mental ability, and go to a new place and recreate yourself. Okay? So, I begin with Dubnov not because he accepts this notion of the wandering Jew in the mythic form, but he did accept the notion that if we want to understand the Jews over time, we have to understand their ability to move from one place to another. Okay? And that's an important notion. And I think that that notion was something which helped writers, thinkers, visual interpreters, when the myth becomes much more pronounced from the 17th century onwards, as I will say in a moment, it was easy to play into the political developments. And so, from the 17th century, though the myth is earlier, from the 17th century, it can have all of these different contexts, because people could possibly think that indeed there is a kind of continuum between that person who did not help Jesus as he was going to Calvary to Jews in a later period. Okay? So in some strange way you could say that the reality of Jewish mobility fit into this notion of the wandering Jew. And I don't know how many of you have plants in your house which are called the wandering Jew. And that's a plant which goes off into all different directions. Okay? So, in a sense, you could say that when one's thinking about the wandering Jew, one is thinking about music, one is thinking about literature, one is thinking about poetry, one is thinking about theater. And there are very few cultures that don't touch this. Okay? Now, I mentioned to you on a previous occasion that how this thing developed for me. And I want to come back to this because I'm always interested in helping you to think about a historical problem and how to deal with it within a visual context. What happened to me is that I had seen for the first time, and those of you who looked at the article, you've seen this painting, and it'll come back, of course, in our discussion, The Wandering Jew of Hirschenberg of 1899. So Hirschenberg comes in 1899 and creates this eternal Jew, or the wandering Jew. And it struck me, how does this thing, where does he come to deal with this figure when so many other issues are present in European life at that time? So from a historian's perspective, when you're looking at a painting like this, you want to try to understand, especially when it's coming from the hands of a Jewish artist, you want to try to understand what brought him to make this particular painting. And then, of course, you begin to think of the different ways in which people interpreted this phenomenon. And I should say one thing, unfortunately, but you can get a hold of the book. A recent exhibition took place at the Israel Museum, which dealt with Jesus in the eyes of Israeli and Jewish art. And one of the first paintings that you see there is the painting of Hirschenberg's The Eternal Jew, or the Wandering Jew. So we're going to come to that later on, and that's something which I began to be interested in. Now, we have some other things which I want you to be aware of. There are many names of the Wandering Jew. The most important one is the name Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus. Now, wherever you look, you'll find people trying to interpret. Why did they choose the name Ahasuerus? Is it coming from the book of Esther in the Bible, of the king Ahasuerus? Okay. Now, it's strange to think that that is the only interpretation, but that is the interpretation that many people use, in the sense that we are dealing with a figure who has particular context. And as you know, in the book of Esther, one of the things which we see as a thematic issue is the fact that Jews, or the people who were living in Ahasuerus' realm, were not willing to bow to him. Okay? This notion of, are you willing to live as a separate people when you're living in a realm which demands certain things of you? But here too we have to remember that the name of the Wandering Jew goes into different cultures, and people give it different names. And I can't, within the context of our discussion today, explain to you all the different names, but there are names like Isaac Lacadème in France, Boutadeus, Matateus, Cartaphilus. In other words, and if you would read some of the literature on the Wandering Jew, if you would read Eugène Sue in France in the 1840s, if you would read Percy Bysshe Shelley's poetry on the Wandering Jew, you would see, or you read Stephen Heim's book on the Wandering Jew, you will see that the Wandering Jew changes his character. He can be a shoemaker, he can be a creative figure, he can be a magician. In other words, when we're thinking of how a myth changes, we have to be aware of the fact that the myth grants this flexibility, this versatility, that you can see this wandering Jew maybe as a hero, maybe as a tragic figure, as a symbol of a certain period. And at some point I'm going to surprise you and show you that somebody, not this gentleman, was able to get a dissertation published in France in the 1890s because he thought, he was working in Charcot's clinic in Salpêtrière. Does the name Charcot mean anything here? A psychological clinic. And this person said, I have distinguished a figure who I consider a psychological figure, and that is the wandering Jew. And we have, as you will see later, some pictures from this dissertation in which the neurosity, the neurotic character of the Jew or the wandering Jew, and he submitted a dissertation to Charcot in Salpêtrière in 1893, and the dissertation was accepted. So, even the notion of sickness, neurosis, sort of characteristics which sometimes people think are representative of the Jew, became an accepted way of thinking about this personality. Okay? And this is the wonders, the excitement, the strange issues when you're speaking about a myth. But the myth sometimes had reality. In other words, there was somebody in the end of the 19th century who said, how can we solve the problem of the wandering Jew? We have to send him back somewhere to his own former home, not necessarily Palestine, where he can relax and relive his life, and then he won't have to feel that he has to continue to wander. Okay? Now, because of that, what you're going to see today, and I'm not going to deal with all the medieval material, and I'm only touching a very small touch of the modern ways in which people envisaged in their minds what was this wandering figure all about. He had gradually, as you will see, some specific characteristics. He is walking with a walking stick. Mm-hmm. He usually has a small little sacket with 5 pennies or 5 medals or 5 coins in this socket. And, now think about this also, sociologically, culturally, he can speak any language wherever he goes. If he goes to Spain, he speaks in Spanish. If he goes to Poland, he speaks in Polish. Wherever he goes, he speaks the language. Now, when you think about this, you can imagine that in the mind's eye, this is a character you would like to see one day. Mostly, of course, as we'll see in a moment, he has memory of something which we all would like to know. The memory of Christ on the cross. And the memory of Christ going to Calvary. So there's this historic notion about this wandering figure who has gone from place to place, who has seen events that we all would like to know about, and therefore, in the mind, in the way the mind works with myths, the character excites us. One last opening comment. At some point, as you will see later on, if you're still with me today, you will hear how people see that maybe my experience, my actual experience, is connected in some way to the experience of Ahasuerus. And since I mentioned him in a previous lecture, I will mention him again before we begin, and that is Richard Wagner. In Judaism, the Jews in music. In Wagner in 1850 writes this very, very significant essay in which he talks about the penetration of Jews into German music and the controversy over the fact that maybe this music that the Jews are doing is changing the nature of our music. He ends this essay, which has created, of course, an endless amount of interpretations, when he says basically that we hope, or I would like their end to be like the end of Ahasuerus. And some people, of course, saw this as being the end of the wandering Jew, meaning the end of the Jews, or the decline of the... but it's of course interesting that someone like Wagner, who was so involved in mythic thinking within the German context, when he's speaking about his modern Jews, he comes back and uses the concept of Ahasuerus. Now, we're going to close the lights, and you're going to start working with me. Okay, now, I have some texts which are going to help you to try to understand maybe the source of how we actually get to, when we finally come to the 13th century, when the wandering Jew as a clear mythic figure emerges. We can look at some of the combinations which went together in terms of creating the myth. And here I bring you something from the legend of Malchus from John 18, from the New Testament, of course. Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that should come upon him, went forth and said unto them, the chief priests and the Pharisees, Whom seek ye? They answered him, We seek Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus saith unto them, I am he. And Judas also, which betrayed him, stood with them. As soon then as he said unto them, I am he, they went backward and fell to the ground. Then asked he them again, Whom seek ye? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus answered, I have told you that I am he. If therefore ye seek me, let these go their way. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it, and smote the high priest's servant, and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Now, take a look at these different. From the legend of St. John and Matthew. Verily I say unto you, there be some standing here which shall not taste of death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Okay, now this of course you know. This notion is if the Jews, or the Jew will remain in society, and this is of course this notion of the eternal people, they will remain until the Son of Man comes, which shall not taste of death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. It's almost like a very difficult moment when the Jew will have to remain as a witness when Christ comes again. And then if I skip to 12:36:59, Cartophilius, who is described as having struck Jesus, and you'll see this in a moment, says to him, "Go on, Jesus, to the judgment prepared for you." And Jesus replies, "I am going just as it is written of me, but you will stay waiting until I return." Okay, the notion that the Jew is going to have to remain as a testimony to Jesus. And then this is a very significant text from 1602, which was published and republished in many different languages. A short story of the Jews with the name of the Jew with the name Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus was born a Jew in Jerusalem. This is what this bishop describes. He was born in Jerusalem. He was a shoemaker. He had been present in person at the crucifixion of Christ. Now, think about this for a moment. This is a very significant person. He's seen a moment which is so significant for Christianity. He took part in the cry, "Crucify him," and he called for the deliverance of Barabbas. When the sentence had been pronounced, this Jew hurried to his house, since the Lord Christ must be led that way so that he could see him. Then when the Lord Christ under his cross was led by, he leaned for a moment against the Jew's house. And you're going to see this. I want you to remember this. We can assume that Christ is going with the cross. He's passing the shoemaker's house. The anger of the Jew rose up more than ever. And with curses, he swears at him. He ordered him to pack and be off to where it was fitting for him to go. In other words, Christ is asking the shoemaker, let me rest in your house. And he is saying to him, "No, go forward." Then Christ spoke to him, meaning, "I will stand here and rest, but you must walk." Now, we still really don't know why in the 13th century, possibly because of the fear of the coming of the Mongols, did this image, this notion that the encounter between Christ and shoemaker or someone else appear. But clearly we don't have any before Chronica Majora by Matthew Paris in the 13th century. Do we have a clear notion of this image of the wandering Jew? Now here you can see this encounter in its earliest form from the 13th century, and as you see, it shows Cartophilius meeting, or Jesus meeting Cartophilius, and the scroll which is coming from each of them goes back to what we see here. "Go on, Jesus, to the judgment prepared for you." And Jesus replies, "I am going just as it is written of me, but you will stay waiting until I return." Okay? Now, this is the 13th century. And what I'm going to show you before I move into the modern period is to show you some figures from the Kurzbeschreibung 1602 of the ways in which this figure is beginning to emerge. Now you see the Yud Ahasuerus in this form. This is 16th century, the beginning of the 17th century. He's in a way walking. And then we have an interesting notion that a Jew of Spanish origin, the rabbi who becomes an important rabbinic figure in Amsterdam, controversial, a person who believes in, thinks that he can find the 10 tribes who are lost. And one of the things that Menashe ben Yisrael is doing, as some of you probably know, in the 17th century, is that he's trying to convince Oliver Cromwell to allow the Jews who were expelled from England in 1290 to be able to return in 1290 to return to England. And Menashe goes to London, makes his plea. You cannot say that it was in the end successful, but you have to understand what Menashe was thinking. The Lord, this is what he writes in Latin, the Lord let the people of Israel be captive and scattered them amongst other peoples, so they might as pilgrims unite them in faith. Here it is demonstrated that although the dispersion of a people over so many parts of the world was indeed a malediction, was a curse, it indeed safeguarded the eternity of Jews. It's like writing history like Dubnov. It may have been a curse. So why does he want the Jews to go to England? Because Menashe claims that if they're not dispersed, there won't be this ability to be eternal. Now why am I bringing in Menashe? Because this becomes Menashe ben Israel's, in the books that he publishes, he uses this not as only as an ex libris, but he uses this as the logo of his books. In other words, here you have, so to speak, a positive depiction of the wandering Jew. He has a sack. He is walking. He has the stick. And it says, the man who is perceived as a pilgrim, 1647, because the notion of the wandering Jew as a blessing is something which Menashe tries to bring about by his various efforts. And one of the things that he says to Cromwell, you know, when Spain dispersed its Jews, Spain fell. It lost a great element. When Portugal expelled the Jews, it lost a great element. Therefore, you should be willing to take the Jews back, and possibly you will grow. Now, look carefully at this. This is Menashe sending his own portrait to Abraham von Frankenberg, my engraved portrait and my symbol, as you see above. Peregrinando quaerimus, with on one side the wandering man, and on the other side a candle, symbolizing and beautifully alluding to the text, thy words are a candle to my feet. So, in the middle of the 17th century, a man who is very much aware of the fact that Jews have been dispersed, that they've gone through different moments in their historic development, makes an effort, and there's a lot of interesting studies, of course, about Menashe and his efforts to bring the Jews back into England. The Jews gradually do return to England at the end of the 17th century, not necessarily because of Menashe, but he turns the wandering Jew into his symbolic figure that represents who he is. And so, now, what I'm going to show you in the first part of this presentation is to show you different ways in which non-Jewish artists of different levels deal with the wandering Jew. Okay? Mm-hmm. Now, this is from 1804 in Paris, and I'll just translate the beginning, the top. This is the true portrait of the Juif errant, who is âgé de plus de 1800 ans. who is more than 1,800 years old. Now, look at what you see in the background, because already you know from the text that I brought you what is happening here. So here we see this man standing, albeit not a very attractive looking man. And look at the scenes in the background. You have there, of course, the 3 crosses on one side, Calvary, and then you see somebody coming to a house. Of course, that's Jesus, coming to someone's house and asking that person to give him the opportunity to rest. But he doesn't let him rest. And Jesus continues on to Calvary. And then you have this scene, and I'm sorry that I didn't bring you a wonderful painting from the 19th century. I thought of this after that I should have brought to you, where you have the wandering Jew speaking to local people in Paris. Now, why do they want to speak to him? You know, because he has seen this scene. And here is this man, 1,800 years old, who has walked through history. You want to meet him. Now what develops together with the text is a long history, which you see on both sides of the image. You have a long history detailing the life of the wandering Jew. So, on the one hand, this person who's produced it wants you to know that this is the true figure of the wandering Jew. And it goes on and tells you about the way he's walked through time and so on and so forth, and the way he's met different people, and so to speak, a kind of history. And this text is repeated again and again, and sometimes changed. So this becomes a very popular image in the 19th century. I show you a few different examples just to give you a sense in which there are variations of the image. And I want to point out this for a moment, because together with the complaint, this is the complaint, the text is called the complaint, you see something here that one of the things that we want to know about the wandering Jew is how he was able to go through areas, different kinds of areas, and to go through the sea, and to go through forests. He's able to penetrate all sorts of places, and he continues to exist. Now, in a sense, you could say this is popular culture. This is the kind of thing that you would buy for a small amount of money. You had very good publishers who were willing to publish them. And at the beginning of the 19th century, they are extremely popular in France more than anywhere else. And of course, they're using the same notion. Le Juif errant, the true portrait of the wandering Jew, and you can see various scenes which are similar to the scene that you saw before. Now, here's another example, just to give you a sense, a clearer sense of this person who we saw. And one of the things that is sometimes added on to the text is that we have actually seen this person who he appeared at some point in Avignon on a certain date. Now, you're all rational people. I hope not. But you should know that these kinds of notions exist. So, you can see it at the top. This is the way he was seen in Avignon on the 22nd of April, 1784. So there's an attempt on the part of the person who's creating this is to give us a true sense of what's happened. And here you have the same notion which goes on and again. Les bourgeois de la ville parlant juif errant. The bourgeois people of the city are speaking to the wandering Jew. Okay? They want to meet him. They want to see what he looks like. Now, I'm jumping. Anybody know what we're seeing? Who we're seeing here? What does he have on his forehead? The mark of whom?
Of Abel.
Of?
Of Abel.
Cain.
Cain.
Of Cain. The mark of Cain. You know who does this? The name Gustave Doré, the great French artist of the 19th century. Now, this appears in a after, this is 1858, and Doré is clearly inspired by the work by Eugène Sue. I'm sorry, 1856. It's inspired by the work of Eugène Sue, but it's interesting the connection he makes. And this is, of course, what artists can do. Why Cain? Why does Cain get associated with the wandering Jew? Go back to the Bible.
Because God marked him with one sign, but there is not a specific one.
What
It
does
was in the
Abel
letter
say?
of to
What?
protect him to be assassinated or revenged by the people, and he was also condemned to sort of going all around the world after his crime.
Okay, so the conflict between Cain and Abel is now being reassociated in the mind of the wandering Jew. And of course, we do know in tradition that Cain and Abel are sometimes symbolically seen as Christianity and Judaism. And here, what Doré has done is given this very strong image of red. Red is very often associated, as we all know when we want to cross the red light, that red is a sign of stop or fear. And so he's given him red hair, a red cape, and here you can see the nose, which is being very much elaborated upon, and he's walking. And he is walking, and he's very thin because he's been walking through time, and you can see, of course, the background. Now, the series that, and I'm not bringing you the entire series, the images which Doré creates in the 1860s becomes extremely popular in many different cultures. I've had different discussions with different people, whether it's anti-Semitic or not. For the moment, it's not my interest at the moment. What is our interest here is to see, and I'll show you some of the images from Doré's series, is to understand how Doré is conceiving the wandering Jew. He's conceiving the wandering Jew as somebody who has been able to walk through history, and therefore he's seen many different scenes. And look closely, you have here the small pouch that he holds. He has this endless beard because he of course hasn't shaved, and he's looking at different scenes as he walks through. Now, remember, Wagner in 1850 is using the notion of Ahasuerus, that the destiny of the Jews would be as Ahasuerus. Now, here we're seeing the ability of Ahasuerus to continue to live on, to go through time. And this is a very important image. Seeing him walking through water as rain is pouring down, and he walks by Christ, and he continues to go wherever he's going. We don't know where he's actually headed. Just take a look what's happening not only on land, but what's happening in the sky, the imagery which Doré is bringing in this phantasmagorial manner. Okay, I'll just show you one more now, but you'll see. It'll be coming back. I want you to see that there's this different temperament. Doré is giving us a very, very dramatic presentation of the Wandering Jew. Though it has great attraction, you'll see crosses all over in his work, as you can see here. And then, of course, when you compare him to this very maybe pleasant figure, doesn't arouse necessarily a sense of antagonism, of this wandering Jew with the complaint which describes him, and that becomes very common. Now, take a look at this and look carefully. Has anybody ever seen this painting? Any of you ever been to Munich? Have you ever been to the Neue Pinakothek? Well, this is where you're headed. Where did I send you last time? I don't remember. But now you got it. Oh, I sent you last time where? To Commando in Paris. So, after you go to Paris, you go to Munich. Now, what do you see here? Madame, I'd like to hear what you say. What?
There's like a group of angels.
You want to speak a bit louder so the others will hear it?
There's like a group of angels, I think, playing trumpets, and then Jesus might be the main character. Dressing in white.
Don't be afraid to say whatever you think. Who's going to help her? Oh, you're not done yet. Go ahead, continue. Now, remember, the painting is the destruction of Jerusalem by Titus. At the end, I will ask you, where is the wandering Jew? But I'm not asking you that right away. Now, this is a painting of 5.5 meters by 7.5 meters. Can you imagine this? The painting was commissioned in the 1830s. Eventually, at the opening of the Neue Pinakothek by Ludwig I of Bavaria, they waited until Kaulbach finished his painting, and it was bought and became part of Ludwig I of Bavaria's possessions, which he gave. And when you go through Munich, of course, you'll see a Kaulbachstrasse. Kaulbach is very important in terms of a German art of this period. So you said to me a few things, and I'm going to want to push you a bit further. Who is this? Remember, it's the destruction of Jerusalem. This is the high priest. Okay. Now, if you look carefully, you of course notice the angels. I can see it's a bit cut here. Unfortunately, there are 4 figures sitting above, which I wonder if I can. Well, for the moment we have enough. You can see Jerusalem burning. You can see Titus and his followers coming in, and they are heralding something. And there's destruction over here in the center. But I want you to now to focus on 2 different scenes. This scene and this scene. Put them one opposite the other. See these figures? You see this figure? This figure is a contrast to the Christian family. The very solemn, the future, the light is there. This area, of course, is dark. There, these are part of the Jews who are being destroyed. And this, of course, are the demons who are sending the wandering Jew out of Jerusalem. Now, this is rare. This is not common. This is very different from, just think of this for a moment. This was the wandering Jew. This was the wandering Jew. And now Kalbach comes and puts this within a Christological sense in which the figure of the wandering Jew is posited against the wholesome Christian family as part of this notion of the destruction of Jerusalem. Now you know that the destruction of Jerusalem was often seen as a result of the fact that Jews crucified Christ. The notion that Jerusalem is being destroyed was an act of, this was the punishment of the Jews, that they were part of the crucifixion. And here we can see what is happening here. Of course, you see the medals which were in the temple. Now, what Kalbach did, even before he finished the painting, and those of you who on your travel to Munich, you'll see the painting. There's a legend which he prepared, which actually describes to you very carefully what is happening in this painting. And he describes, of course, the fact that this is the wandering Jew. Now, to this day you can see the painting. It's central to the Neue Pinakothek. And at the same time, I want you to remember that in Munich of the late 19th century, Polish artists, among them some Jews, are often coming to study in Munich. And they will see this painting. But before that, I'm showing you one other work, which is by a Hungarian, in this case, Jewish artist, not really very well known, by the name of Adolf Herschel. Was born in 1860 and died in 1933. And this is Ahasuerus and the End of the World. And I'm bringing this because this is part of this symbolism of the late 19th century, which Herschel gets himself involved in. And I just want to read something because I don't want to get this wrong. You can see here the last man in this wilderness was caught between the angel of hope. Here's the angel of hope. And the specter of death. So here is your wandering Jew between these two figures. This is, by the way, the kind of figure that appears often in the depiction of justice in the Dreyfus affair. And before the wandering Jew, who is portrayed in this very difficult way, lies a fallen female, who is the personification of dead humanity. And crows, the crows are circling around in this ominous manner. So primary light appears to radiate. Some light appears from the distant angel who hovers above before the stormy sky. Now, I'm bringing you this mostly because I want you to know that there are these very different interpretations. Ahasuerus is seen as part of symbolist art. And then you have Le Juif almost like a Superman. I could have brought you many different images like this. So he's seen, and he can appear on matchboxes and cigarettes and so on and so forth. So there's this popularization at the same time that there's this very strong personification within the context of art, of high art. Now, this is the dissertation that I mentioned to you. So, just think about this issue, that this is the period, just Charcot comes a few years before Freud's great appearance, okay? And Freud will interestingly appear later on in a different way. So, the notion of sickness, a historian at Chicago University by the name of Goldstein, Jan Goldstein, wrote a very important work which deals with the connection between sickness and anti-Semitism at the end of the 19th century. So you can see that this is something in which the figure of the wandering Jew, a sort of a desolate, he's not necessarily wandering, but it's his psychic situation, his mental situation, which is bringing him into this dissertation, which is discussing the symptoms of what a wandering Jew is all about, that he's come to a point that he is such a depressed individual. And then there's this other image of the neurotic Jewish wanderer. Now, this all appears in that same dissertation. So in that sense, you could say that there were people in Salpêtrière, in a very important psychiatric institution in France at the end of the 19th century, who believe that there is something like this, a neurotic figure, and because of the wandering, this is what has happened to the Jew. And it says at the bottom, the neurotic Jewish wanderer. Now this is in the background, before we turn our tables. Maybe, oh, there's one more. This is remarkable. I want you to take a look at this. Here's where reality and myth merge so wonderfully. Why do they merge? This is 1892. What is happening in 1892? Who's going where?
Jews going from Russia.
I don't want to hear you, I want to hear them.
To United States.
What?
U.S. going to United States
Okay.
because it's the image of Tiosan.
So this is the beginning of the tremendous mass migration of Jews. The beginning of the mass migration of Jews from Eastern Europe to America, to the United States. And so this is, Jews are being thrown out. And remember this, because the last image you're going to see in this work, in this lecture, will be from 1980. And you will try to remember this when we get there. You see this figure, maybe the Russian symbol of the Russian figure, Russian ruler, Russian Tsar, sending these Jews out on their wandering. And they're not together with the wandering Jew. This is a wonderful caricature. The wandering Jew is on a different path. And his path is, so to speak, he is in the triptych. You have the wanderers coming from Eastern Europe, coming to America, and being received wonderfully by America. But at the same time, you have this figure who is not like the others. He's not part of them. But he is the historic myth. And of course, he is being seen in direct contrast to Jesus at Calvary. So, in this sense, the French caricaturist who created this wanted to make an association between the mythic figure and the historic phenomenon which is happening at that time. And of course, the way he shows these Jews, you can see they all have a very unpleasant looking figure. They're going with whatever they have, and they are being received and welcomed as they go by ship to the United States, and that's where the sun is shining or will shine on them. Why does he do it in 1892? Because this is coming in the footsteps. This is before the Dreyfus Affair, but it's following the work of a very important anti-Semitic work written in 1886 by somebody by the name of Drummond, called La France Juif. 1886 was the first edition. It has been since published in over 280 editions. That is the notion that France became Judaized, and so here you can see the problematics. Now, at this stage, we're going to move into a different world. And this is very important for you to recognize that, and this happens to myths in many different cultures. At some point, the negative myth or the problematic myth is taken over by those who are being perceived by the other. Okay? In other words, Mauritius Gottlieb, the Polish Jewish artist, is probably the first artist of Jewish origin who is now identifying with the wandering Jew. In other words, and since on your way from Paris to Munich you will go to the Narodowa Museum in Krakow, and you'll see this interesting, now look what Gottlieb, who has a very short life but a very productive life, dies in 1879 when he's about 23, had an unhappy life, but he was really seen as one of the great figures of and students of the Polish artist Matejko. Gottlieb gives us here something which is very important. He puts a crown on the Jew. And on the crown he puts a Magen David, the Star of David. Mm-hmm. He puts him in this red, with this red background, in an Orientalist kind of way. He gives him an earring. Interesting to see the way he uncovers his shoulder, but you can clearly see, you know, if we were playing around, we would say, doesn't he have this very morose, melancholic approach as this figure in Mage's dissertation? As I said before, this is 1876, he dies 3 years later. He's a man who's had unsuccessful relations with a woman whom he deeply loved. But here, what is important for us is to notice the fact that Gottlieb, who was in Munich, like many other Polish painters, obviously saw, knew Kaulbach, obviously saw, knew Doré, and is now taking upon himself the image, and this has very clear resonance of a self-portrait of Gottlieb with special lips, and these eyes which are very, very typically Gottlieb, and he is now seeing himself as Ahasuerus. Now, what is he doing? I'll tell you about him in a moment. What do you see here? Hirschenberg is born in Łódź, 1865, dies in Palestine in 1908, studies in Munich in the 1880s. One cannot think that he did not see Kaulbach's painting. And he probably saw other paintings, and I'm going to give you some references in a moment. But I want to hear from you, what do you see in the background? What do you see happening here?
Okay, this is a different sort of depiction, a new one of course, and he is in a sort of agony. He is passing through the wood of different crosses. It's also some representation of the historical line from that first very historical Christ crucifixion to the actual point when the very picture is depicted. And downstairs are a lot of human corpses. One of these is covered with talit. It's on the right side, down there. And there is, as a symbol of also Jewish pogrom, different episodes of Jewish history, and there is also that women naked figure. All of them are naked, so basically they are depicted as a symbol of all kind of death. And in fact it is a depiction of that agony of wandering through all, but connected more with the Jewish history than European one. This is a perspective of Jewish painter more than a picture of a Jew depicted by the European artist. So it's also the agony of Shmuel Kirchenberg himself.
Okay, anybody else want to add something? What else do you see here? Just one thing that Volk didn't say, which I think is very important. He is like a Christ-like figure. Okay? In other words, he is emerging from a world of crosses. And then there's this social, if you will, social political comment that he's making. Why are all these people lying dead? They're lying dead because of the crosses. So, if you like, this is a very anti-Christian painting on the part of a Jew in Poland at the end of the 19th century. And he's emerging in this way because of the light that he's seeing, but if you see in a way that the crosses, this forest of crosses, is even covering the light that was in the background. But he is emerging strangely. In other words, here is one person who is able to emerge from the crosses, and when you think back to Kaulbach, and I'll show it to you in context in a moment, you can see that there's something, and what was saying is of course correct, that it represents in some way a social message, it represents something of his own experience, and this painting had, over time in the 20th century, tremendous resonance because it became a kind of symbol of the Holocaust and of other moments in the historic development of the Jews. But here we can see how Hirschenberg is taking this figure, bringing him out of the world of destruction, and moving and going somewhere else but alone. Now, it's important to think about this also in terms of the social message that he is making. He does not want this to be seen within a Jewish context alone. He sends this painting to the Paris International Exhibition in 1900. And with the thought that the painting would be received, and it actually does receive a certain level of a medal. But it's clear that this was very much a profound expression of a man who has been working on this painting for several years. And if we look at it within the context of something else which he does, the Black Banner of 1905, you can see that there is an element in Hirschenberg of this great fear. There have been different interpretations of this painting below, but it is also one of these processions which Hirschenberg becomes very deeply involved in. And you wonder, of course, when you look at these figures, what they're all frightened by. There's maybe one figure who we can see, and maybe this is the kind of the future. We have this one young man who, amidst all these very unsavory looking, quite frightened individuals, there's this one figure who may be possibly seeing the light. But we don't know what light that actually is. And this is a painting which is in the Jewish Museum in New York. Now, let me come back. And this you all know, right? And this is Delacroix. Okay. Now, was this the inspiration? Was this the inspiration? And I'm showing you one image which you didn't see before, which is when the wandering Jew is finally in the other world and he's resting. Just take a look at this possibility of interpretation of how Hirschenberg may have been trying to create a different image, or even if you're looking at his teacher, Matejko, with the light in the background of this, also of a mythic figure, Werni Hora, who appears in different areas of Polish culture at that time. And then we have to go back and see something else which we brought in the article. This is Hirschenberg sitting already in Palestine, in Jerusalem, with Orishatz, the creator of Bezalel. But this particular image, which we unfortunately have not been able to see, but only this was sold at a Sotheby's exhibition, we couldn't find it. Now here you have Moses, and from his hand, where is the sign of what Christ had, coming out this, he's sort of in this scene where you have all these wanderers in the background. Another sense in which even when he comes to Palestine, he doesn't really feel a sense that the end is over. Though here we can see him in a somewhat more content manner. But there is the sense in which, and I'll come back to him in a moment, there is a sense in which he really believes that Jews are wanderers. Now what does this guy do? This is a very interesting figure. was killed and dies in the war of 1943. What is he doing? If you would open the journal of Jewish Renaissance called Ost und West in 1901, a very important magazine which came out in German at the beginning of the 20th century, you would see this work of Nozick, who goes through himself very different periods. The sculpture is lost. What has he done? He's turned around the meaning. It's not Hirschenberg with the fear of the crosses and the anger of the crosses. What Nozick is doing here is really going back to Michelangelo's Moses, giving him this very tremendous beard. He is not the weak. You remember the feet of Doré, very thin. Here we have a man who's very strong, creative. He's wearing the hat of freedom, the freedom hat. And you could probably say that this wandering Jew is saying, almost like Moses, we were able to walk through the world. Why? Because we had the scroll of law always with us. So now you can see a complete rejection. Wandering is not something which has been imposed upon the Jew. It's something which the Jew took upon himself, was willing to go forward, but he needed a spiritual element to keep him going. And as I said it now, keep him going, those of you who are interested in gender could have asked me at some point, are there any wandering Jewesses? It's almost always a wandering Jew is a male figure. But here it's very interesting. This is a sculpture, very strong sense in which you see this man, this mosaic-like figure walking through time with the Phrygian hat, and that is a sense of freedom. I do it because I am spiritually designed. Now, Hirschenberg does something else, and this is a painting which is unfortunately lost. People have looked for it. He is concerned with this notion of wandering. And this was a painting which he thought that he would exhibit together with the painting of the wandering Jew. And this is his notion of wandering, bringing together people of all different elements. Do we know where they're going? No. They're walking in some very cold area. You can see the way their coats, it's cold. There's nothing in the vicinity. There's one leader, maybe Moses is leading them on. There's somebody holding a scroll of law, the young woman holding the kettle. These will become very, very symbolic notions of the Jews walking through land. Now, it's interesting, and I just bring this as a kind of relief, that when the wandering Jew comes with Hirschenberg to Palestine, this is the painting that Boris Schatz wants very much to be the background as he stands with different figures of the Zionist movement. In other words, Schatz believed that there should be a place within Bezalel, which became the museum in Palestine and the arts and crafts school, that there would be a place where you could see depictions of the past, a kind of room of sadness, so to speak. And here he's standing with a very important figure, somebody I mentioned at the beginning, who was in constant conflict with Dubnov over the conception of Jewish history. Now, This is an icon. It is one of the classic icons of the Zionist movement. The androgynous figure, standing high with in an angelic way, touching the weary, wandering Jew, leaning on a stick, and saying to him, "Go follow the tiller of the land." And this was for the 5th Zionist Congress in Basel in 1901. And there you see the very common symbol of the New World. This is actually an Orthodox figure who is tilling the land. This is not barbed wire, I think, but thistles. In other words, he is encumbered by the past. And then in this way, and this is of course Ephraim Moses Lillian, one of the important, at that point, Zionist artist. And he adds to the bottom of this poster, which became very, very common, and our eyes should see Zion in Berachamim, with pity, or and this is with the influence of Birdsley, and you can see the scroll of the Magen David on this androgynous figure, as he's telling him, "Rise, go up, and follow." Now, okay. Before we come to Chagall, and you'll see the Wandering Jew in many different ways in Chagall's work, I wanted to show you another artist, comes to Palestine in 1930, studied with Hermann Struck in Germany. His name is Budko, and this is from a rare depiction of a figure from the Passover Haggadah, and in this notion of the poor person who is wandering, Budko presents this wanderer walking in a different direction of Hirschenberg's Galut, but this is even much more interesting. And allow me to interpret this as Budko, who is leaving Poland, and after a visit to his hometown in Plonsk, creates this image which becomes eventually another Zionist icon in 1931, or not so much an icon like the 1901 image. It becomes an icon for the Congress, the 12th Congress in 1931. And here you see this wandering Jew walking past crucified Jesus. But something interesting, I think, happens here. And I won't go into this too much. What is happening here is you see the legs of Christ, and you see the upper body of the wandering Jew. Symbolically, you could clearly say that without the legs, or without Christ, the wandering Jew would not be. Without the wandering Jew, Christ would not be. And so it's a very focused attempt to depict this moment in time when these two figures are, so to speak, relating to each other. And you can see the very deep meaning emanating from the face of this Orthodox Jew as he walks by the cross. Now with Marc Chagall, of course, one enters into a different world. And the more you look at Chagall, and not only at his very popular images, you will very often see the wandering Jew. And Chagall actually saw himself as a wanderer. And he clearly brings in this figure in different ways as he here moves from Vitebsk, over Vitebsk, his hometown, and he'll eventually come to Paris and then move into other places. And here, the way we see Chagall so often, he's leaving the church behind, he's leaving the large church in the background, and he's coming to a new place, and therefore he has his sack on his back, he has his walking stick, he's moving into a new context. This is 1914. And this Professor Castaño put on the cover of the series. Again, you see this wandering Jew being non-tortured, non-suffering. A figure, not a very large figure, but you can see the background again is his home, his particular setting in Eastern Europe, in Vitebsk. As he moves on, he has his walking stick, and he's always alone in this context. Notice that the wandering Jew is seldom within the Jewish way of portrayal, except if you look at Hirschenberg's Galut. The wandering Jew is very much a person alone. He is symbolically expressing the experience of migration, which was a central element of modern Jewish society, especially in the 20th century. Now this is 1935. Now he's upside down. Flowers in the street. This is already a sense in which Chagall is beginning to sense the interwar period, the trials and tribulations of modernity, the trials and tribulations, and the flower pot itself is not very steady. In the same way that the flower pot is not very steady, the wandering Jew is topsy-turvy. But then, of course, comes the artist with Yellow Christ, 1938. Now, for those of you who have never seen these images of Chagall, you should know something important about Chagall. Chagall is one of the artists who brings in not only the wandering Jew, but also brings in Christ as the symbolic sufferer of the Jews. He does this early on in his career, and he will do it for many years, and we'll see another in a moment. And so this time he's covering his loin area with a talit. And this is what you can say is he's making Christ Jewish. And he's putting him on the cross, and he's symbolically seen as the sufferer, and seeing Christ symbolizing the suffering of the Jew. Now, I should mention this because this is important. At the end of the 19th century, it happens already a bit earlier with someone by the name of Abraham Geiger. But from the end of the 19th century, it becomes much more pronounced that in various areas of Jewish thinking and writing, there's an attempt on the part of Jewish writers and thinkers to bring Jesus back into the fold, to see him as part of Jewish culture, to see him as part of Jewish tradition. And to give you an example of this, a work which became probably one of the most popular books in Palestine in Palestine in the pre-war period, pre-1939, was a book written by an author by the name of Kleusner. It was called Jesus the Jew. It was called Jesus the Jew. Went through many editions. It was read by many people in Palestine of the early 20th century. In other words, and then of course this exhibition which I just mentioned, which took place at the Israel Museum, is maybe an outpouring of this notion. So Jesus has a new tradition evolving in Jewish culture at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, and in the artistic world, this is what we can say Chagall is doing. He is seeing Christ as being the most symbolic figure of suffering, and by identifying him as a Jew who is suffering on the cross, he's actually, so to speak, appropriating him to Jewish tradition and to Jewish culture, and therefore we see again this interesting connection between the wandering Jew and the cross, but of course covered with the talit. And then this very powerful painting, the white crucifixion of 1938. Now, I want you to look. This is pre-Holocaust, born of his understanding of what's happened in Eastern Europe, and sorry, I didn't write it down. You have here on top of Christ, what he writes at the top is can't see it from here either, but it's written in Hebrew, and now you have different scenes happening. All these different relationships to Christ. This figure running away with the scroll, the wandering Jew going in this direction, and all the other scenes that are happening, but Christ, of course, is at the center with his talit. And you have the figures above, one with phylacteries, one covering his eyes, and so on and so forth. The burning synagogue, the ransackled area, the burning homes, maybe an association here to the Russian Revolution, and of course the way in which the white area in the center, and Jesus' body covered with white, and his private and his area here, his personal area, is covered by the Sefer Torah. And in a sense, this, and here of course you can see another scroll of law, as it's coming out and coming up here until it comes to the up to the ladder which brings you to Christ. And so in a sense, Chagall is concerned that one recognizes Jesus as this historic figure, as a symbol of Jewish suffering, and all these other elements around him give you a sense in which maybe there is something here which connects him to all these other developments, but not in the sense in which Hirschenberg would have wanted us to see that it was because of the cross that Jews suffered. Now, I promised you. Sigmund Freud, writing at around the same time that Chagall creates his white crucifixion. Freud is at that point in Vienna, writes to his son who is in London. I sometimes compare myself with the old Jacob, who when a very old man was taken by his children to Egypt. You know the story from the Bible. Let us hope that it won't also be followed by an exodus from Egypt. It is high time Ahasuerus came to rest somewhere. Okay. Now it's very interesting. I mean, you can't, of course, think about Freud without thinking about the subconscious. That he is, at this point, in this very critical moment when people are trying to bring him out of Austria, thinking that he has to get out in order to be saved, that all of a sudden he sees himself in some way. It is high time Ahasuerus came to rest somewhere, and maybe at some point I have to come to rest somewhere. And so at some point when you go to London and you see the Freud Museum, or you go to Vienna and you see the Freud Museum, keep this in mind, that at this point in time, 1938, just as Chagall was doing the white crucifixion, Freud is thinking about his moment in time, and he associates himself with the historic past. Now, I don't know why I put 1913 here. It shouldn't be here, but you see what I'm showing you. I think I'm going to move on. Now, does Ahasuerus actually rest? Does Palestine create a moment of rest? Ahasuerus doesn't die in Palestine or in Israel. He continues to have another life. And here I'm bringing you an image which unfortunately has been over time not well treated. It's near Haifa in the north of Israel. A painting, a sculpture done by a Russian-born Jew by the name of Polis, who presents here two figures, joining them together, very much touching each other, and the larger figure, almost like this messianic figure, this wandering figure, with the shofar on his belt, and the walking stick, significantly giving us this association of the wanderer. And he is put together with a pioneer, much shorter than he is, probably because he does not want to give us the sense that he has this great past like the figure with the large beard. His upper body is naked. He's holding a sword in one hand and a sickle in another. in a sense, you could say that they are joined together in a kind of association, that they are going to, one is bringing us the past, the other is bringing us the future. They are in some way connected one with each other. And yet, a young Jerusalemite passed away early on at 1999 when he was only 54, Cohen, who goes off to New York at some point and then comes back to Israel, dies of cancer early. He creates a wandering Jew in 1988. And he creates a wandering Jew which is really in conversation with, I didn't have time to translate this into English for you, from the Bird's Head Haggadah of the beginning of the 14th century in Germany. Now, you have the wandering Jew with the head of the Bird's Head Haggadah. The Bird's Head Haggadah was known, became very, very well known because of the fact that in almost all of the images in this Passover Haggadah, the heads of the figures are like you see here. Okay? They are strangely portrayed, like birds. And then he puts on the Bird's Head Haggadah an anti-Jewish hood, an anti-Jewish hat, and he has two different figures, one sending him out and one maybe receiving him, or the demonic figure sending him out. Maybe God's hand is, but notice it's a Christian symbolic figure that is maybe receiving the wandering Jew as he walks by a chair which is probably in some way close to the notions of Van Gogh. So in a sense you see here a man who was very tall in himself. He had a very good-looking young man. As he walks through time, born in Palestine, but associating himself now with this mythic figure as he walks through time. And just before the last one, which I'll show you, before the last one, I'm showing you a Georgian artist who comes to live in Israel. His sister dies of cancer. His name is Meir Pichhajda. And in a recent exhibition in Haifa, I saw this work where you see Pichhajda depicting himself as a man walking alone in this new land of his and holding those elements which he associates with himself or the wanderer, the baggage and the books. And you can remember in this context the notion that Heinrich Heine spoke of early in the 19th century of the book as being the portable homeland. Okay. You walk through land, you walk through territory, and you can of course think of the images that we saw until now, especially of Doré and others. Pichhajda seeing himself as this lone figure, going with his possessions, all the possessions he has, even though he has emigrated from Georgia to Israel, still very much a sense of his loneliness. And now, the last image I'm going to show you. The artist is R.B. Kitai. Sadly, Kitai committed suicide several years ago. I was fortunate to have the opportunity to see him when he was in California. Kitai was very much associated for years with a London group of artists, among them Lucian Freud. And it's very interesting what happens to Kitai. At some point, he feels when he's in London that his work was not received well by English art critics. His wife writes a very nasty article claiming that they didn't like him because of his Jewish associations, and there were many in his work. And then we have here a Jewish writer. Now let's look closely. I mentioned to you about an hour ago that I wanted you to think about a triptych, about somebody sending somebody off and somebody maybe receiving. Now, look closely at what we see here. We see a man who's clearly a very modern type, with dandy look, dandy dressed, white shoes, a yellow sweater, a red shirt, not a very happy man, sitting in a train. And you see that he's not only sitting on a chair, but he's sitting on a horse, which can have associations to Rembrandt and others, but the notion of something very incongruous. The one thing he does have as a possession is a book. Once again, associating this modern Jew with the intellect. Now, it's a triptych. This is 1, this is 2, and this is 3. We have somebody standing in a very dandy-like way with a whip. So you can possibly assume that the person with the whip is maybe a Nazi, or some figure who has committed him to go somewhere. And where is he possibly going, if not to Calvary? But if you look what's happening here, the relationship between the cross and the hill and the smoke emanating from the chimney, you can possibly assume that Kitai is creating a sense in which this rider is in a train, possibly going to his end, possibly going to a concentration camp. And the fact that he puts the cross at the top next to the smoke emanating from something, apparently emanating from a chimney, would give us a sense that maybe he knows where he is designated. So he doesn't call him the wandering Jew. He calls him the Jewish writer. There is a very interesting painting, which I didn't bring you, from Rembrandt on the Polish writer. There may be an association here, but it's clear that Kitai is in this way connecting the experience of the modern Jew, the modern intellectual Jew, with past history and to the phenomenon of the wandering Jew. And with this, I conclude. Thank you. So, We have time for questions, do we? Comments? What do you want to look at again? Or you're or you're too tired?
Sorry. Excuse my English. I would like to ask something. Yes. I would like to ask you something.
Please.
I don't know why. The wandering Jew is always bringing with him.
The wandering Jew is always,
Bringing with him 5 things. Is it a symbolic number, or because even in the sorry.
not necessarily a symbolic number, it's basically saying that he doesn't need very much to get to live, you know.
But the 5 things are also depicted in one of the last pictures. 5 things. The man going to Israel with 2 luggage and 3 books, perhaps? Or it's just...
I'm not sure I heard the last part of what you said to me.
in the... We have saw a painting,
Yes,
a man going to Israel,
yes,
and he was wearing 2 suitcases and
Yes.
3 books, and it's also the 5 again. It's not something. Coincidence. From here, I see 3 books.
you see 5. Well, you have 3 books and two suitcases.
Yes,
Interesting.
but it's not not the symbol or meaning of the 5.
I don't think so, but it's an interesting way of thinking about it. I think that he's using a different notion. He's using 2 very clear associations. One, look at these very heavy books and these very old kind of suitcases. I wouldn't connect it with the 5 coins, but it's an interesting thought that I'd be interested in pursuing. That's all I could say.
Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about the reception of Kirchenberg, this wandering Jew, but through the different Jewish opinions?
The reception of Hirschenberg,
Yeah, about the Jewish critique of Kirchenberg. It's interesting.
let me come to you in a second. I want to put this on. You know, it's interesting. This painting is rarely shown in the Israel Museum. And that's a very interesting example of the problem today of showing this painting. It's a very difficult painting, and I know people who came and saw it for the first time in the recent exhibition were shocked by it. So what was important for someone like Schatz, who had an agenda, and his agenda was that he wanted this to be integrated into his Zionist vision of the future. It had problems. It was shown in an exhibition about 30 years ago. It's kept downstairs in the storeroom. And I would say that so in the last 40, 50 years, people have rarely seen it. Okay? This other painting of his, this painting has had tremendous resonance, but it's lost. People have looked for it. And it had resonance because it was taken over by different artists throughout the 20th century. Because at some point, this is something which we should be aware of, that a painting can take on, like Chagall's White Crucifixion, takes on meaning after a certain event, after the Holocaust, you looked at this painting and said, well, this is like a prophecy of what was going to happen. And so different artists are using this in different ways, and you see it in many different contexts. Dr. Reiner and I wrote an article on the way the painting was received by other artists, mostly because it's important to see the resonance at different times. And there is an Israeli historian who actually put this on his book because he wanted to show his identification. And this is what we're speaking of. You can identify, if you feel that this expresses your understanding of life, you could maybe see this in this way. So I would say that the Wandering Jew of Hirschenberg has not had that kind of success, mostly because it arouses in people so much. It's a very difficult painting to look at. It's also very large. It's not as large as Kaulbach, but it's something like 3 by 4. It's a very large painting. I don't remember exactly the measurements. Anything else? Yeah,
If I may,
sure.
I have a question about the. I see that from the late 19th century, the cross becomes a symbol in Jewish artists of a symbol for Jewish suffering. And I think that this is very parallel to the process of Judification of the figure of Jesus also. Does it start at the end of the 19th century? Because I don't know from previous centuries that idea of the cross in Jewish art as a symbol for Jewish suffering. And I thought even that it was
Rejected.
that it was even later than it was originated by the Holocaust. But I mean, this certain that from these paintings, already by the end of the 19th century in Eastern Europe, the cross was already perceived as a Jewish symbol, symbolizing the Jewish suffering.
It's a bit of a leap of interpretation. In other words, I wouldn't say that this is not an easy, when Chagall does what he does, that's not an easy thing for people to accept. This is not easy for most Jews to see that, you know, seeing a talit on Christ is not simple. And so that's why there is something happening, and that's why I mentioned Geiger and I mentioned Klausner. There is something beginning to happen at the end of the 19th century, but to come and say what you've said, that the cross becomes a Jewish symbol, that's a bit of leap of interpretation. I would say that you know, I have this memory which all of a sudden you're sparking in me. I was walking somewhere in the Uffizi in Florence in 1972, and all of a sudden a young Israeli girl who had never seen Christ on the cross heard that we were speaking, my wife and I were speaking in Hebrew, and she says, "Who is this that appears on all these paintings?" And I said, the Zionist revolution succeeded. She hasn't seen the cross. So I wouldn't jump to that, but I would clearly say that Chagall is doing something visually which is very powerful. It's very different from what Mr. Butko did here. You know, when you think of how to bring in the cross, I mean, so I think we're dealing with, and those of you who've seen, because you didn't see, but in the recent exhibition in the Israel Museum, it was remarkable to see how many Israeli artists are using the cross to depict sometimes very difficult scenes politically. So, I'm trying to think if we're going to have time in one of the next lectures that I would bring you some of those images, because it'd be interesting for you to see what's happened in the way by doing something on Jesus in modern contemporary Israeli art. You could see some forms of interpretation, not only suffering, but maybe seeing the cross as being a symbol of all sufferings. And that's being done by people who are now. Has anybody seen the Last Supper of Adi Ness, the Israeli photographer? Then I have to do. You'll allow me to make some additions to one of the two lectures, because I would want you to see some of these images. They're very powerful in terms of how younger Israelis are. Adi Ness, N-E-S, a very well-known photographer who has all of the issues. He's homosexual, he's Oriental. What the internet can do. Maybe you. But I'm gonna bring a good image. Yeah.
Soldiers.
The soldiers.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know it. You could show it around. What else can I do for you tonight? Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.